Okay, let's get underway. Good afternoon and welcome. This is another roundtable series of our Dentons Global Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. Today, we're going to be tackling the issue of infrastructure with particular focus on the grid and grid modernization and implementation of the Infrastructure Act. My name's Clint Vince, and I chair Denton's energy practice and co-chair our 1200 professional global sector with my friend and colleague, Emma Hand. Emma and I also co-chair this think tank. We have a pretty amazing panel today, I think. Pat Hoffman with DOE is really at the epicenter of these issues for the agency. She's the principal deputy assistant secretary in the Office of Electricity. Our good friend and client, Chris Gubman-McCabe with Anterix is chief regulatory and communications officer. And Anterix is following the principle that you really can't modernize the electric grid without modernizing communications. And so they're bringing private LTE networks to the utility industry. We're thrilled that our friend Karen Whalen has been able to join us. She is the CEO of the GridWise Alliance and really has shaped some of the legislation that we're focusing on today. And our other dear friend, Kelly Donnelly, who is an executive vice president and general counsel with Lot 16. Andrew Shaw will be our moderator today. He is a superstar in our public policy group, but he's also deeply embedded in our energy practice and tracks all of our key issues for our energy clients. I do want to give a shout out to another friend, Lori Burkhart, the editor-in-chief of Public Utilities Fortnightly. And this publication will be covering our meeting today and always does a fantastic job. If you don't have a subscription to Puff yet, you need to have it. And we're very grateful to Lori for frequently covering our webinars. And with that, I'm going to ask Andrew to carefully and quickly give a better introduction of our panelists, and then we will get underway. I do want to remind folks that we do have a Q&A feature on this Zoom platform. Please try to use that if you have questions so that Andrew doesn't have to monitor the chat room, the Q&A, and have an intriguing conversation with our guests all at the same time. So welcome everyone, and I'm really looking forward to hearing our conversation today. Andrew?
Well, thank you very much, Clint, and thank you to everyone joining today, and a special thank you to our panelists today. We are very fortunate, as Clint mentioned, to have such a distinguished group today to share their perspectives and thoughts on the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. As Clint mentioned, I'll just give a very brief introduction for the four panelists. We have Pat Hoffman, the acting assistant secretary for the Office of Electricity. As many in this industry know, Pat has been an integral part of many discussions on the grid for many years, going back to the implementation of the stimulus bill back in 2009. So we are very honored to have her with us today. Dr. Karen Whalen, President and CEO of GridWise Alliance. Karen has had many different roles through the years, including working with the Department of Energy, working on the current quadrennial energy review, along with stints on the Hill, working for former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Chris Gubman-McCabe is at Anterix, a client, as we have discussed, where he is a serves as the Chief Regulatory and Communications Officer and brings with his experience a lot of great work in the telecom and now in the grid sector. And then finally, Kelly Donnelly, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Lot 16. Kelly has incredible experience both in Congress and the executive branch, most recently serving as Chief Republican Counsel on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee for then Chairman Lisa Murkowski. So again, thank you to this distinguished group, and we are looking forward to a great discussion today. Maybe to jump into it, it'd be great to get some brief comments from each of our panelists on the importance of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And maybe we will start with the Assistant Secretary.
So thank you, Andrew. And I want to thank Dentons for hosting this meeting, and as well as our panelists, because I think it's going to be a great conversation. So I appreciate everybody joining me here today. The bipartisan infrastructure law is really an investment in our nation's infrastructure and in job creation. It is a key part of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. We all recognize that infrastructure is extremely important. And as part of this provides $62 billion for the Department of Energy to really work on a clean energy future, but also advance multiple aspects of our energy infrastructure. That includes manufacturing, that includes jobs, it includes clean energy deployment, but it also includes advancing our electric grid. We all recognize, as some of the conversation has started this morning, how important the electric grid is to achieving the goals. We recognize lessons learned from extreme weather events, the wildfires, Hurricane Ida, the Texas freeze, the heat domes, the derechos. We have a lot of work to do in really thinking about how do we upgrade our infrastructure to create more resilient communities moving forward. And that's one thing to think about as we think about smart communities moving forward. But also on the opposite side is we have a huge opportunity for growth in the electric infrastructure as we think about electric vehicle deployments. There is a huge opportunity of thinking about how do we modernize and expand the electric grid. We want the electric grid to be the platform for innovation moving forward. And what I've been trying to say is we really need to think about how do we align our objectives, how do we accelerate investments in infrastructure, and how do we allow for innovation? And that is really some of the things that communities, the utility industry, really needs to think hard about that. And I think this panel is a great kind of foundation to start that dialogue, because we know we're all committed to, a clean future, a resilient future, and a reliable future. And so that's what we really want to build upon today. So I look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Assistant Secretary. Kerry, you want to weigh in next?
Yeah, sure. There's been a lot of focus on the transmission and the needs in the country and the need to build out transmission, both for resilience, reliability, and to integrate, utility scale renewables. But less attention focused on the distribution system, and I think that's particularly important when we're talking to a group of people about smart cities. Is that the electricity system is changing so rapidly, but it's not changing fast enough to keep up with the things that we want, the functions that we want that grid to be able to deliver, both from distributed energy resources and the utility scale renewables, but also cybersecurity, physical threats, other things that are coming at the grid, transportation electrification. And this bipartisan infrastructure law has a significant amount of federal dollars that will really leverage private capital to accelerate what we need to see in terms of modernizing the grid. So many of these decisions are made at the state level. And, and in the case of regulated utilities, who many of whom own distribution systems, they've got a public utility commission that they have to answer to, or it may be the ratepayers and the owners of public power. And this federal funding will help de-risk some of the decisions that they have to make, because these are big, expensive projects, and we will really see, I think, over the next 5 years of spending, a real acceleration of the modernization. And I also hope what it does is that it kind of equals the playing field so that we don't have a city that doesn't have, the basic building blocks of smart grid like SCADA systems and advanced meters versus another city where all those investments have been made. Because if we don't have an even playing field, we will see more inequities develop over time between customers who have access to that modern grid and customers that don't.
Well, thanks, Karen. Maybe we'll turn to Kelly next.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, the IIJA, which I'm trying to force myself to say instead of BIF, the IIJA is incredibly important. It's a nearly $1 trillion package, and it was passed in the Senate on a bipartisan basis from 69 to 30, including got the support of not only my former boss, Lisa Murkowski, but Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell as well. So a big deal in a 50-50 Senate. And it deals with transmission, of course, but it's a sweeping measure. It also deals with roads and bridges and broadband and cyber, and all under the auspices of climate change. So it's very significant. And in addition to actual authorizations, which we see a lot in Congress, this bill delivers real dollars. It's real money. So not just an authorization bill, but an appropriations measure as well. And I think it's a really big accomplishment for this administration that in a lot of ways was getting overshadowed by efforts on the Build Back Better reconciliation measure. It was really, I think, in a way got overlooked. But now that we're going into implementation, there's so much eyes on the Department of Energy with just unprecedented amount of dollars to get out the door. Really, the significance of this package can't be overstated.
Thanks, Kelly. I'll turn over to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. When you go last and you're part of such an awesome panel, you end up just checking off things that you were going to say because you don't want to be repetitive. And so I'll just say it's fantastic. I do want to take a half step back and say, thank you, Andrew, to you and Clinton, the team at Dentons, and to Karen and the team at Gridwise. I know we were working as a team many months ago on the framework for this legislation. And I think, we're here talking about energy and the evolution of grid, and that wasn't a foregone conclusion. Infrastructure didn't always include the grid. There wasn't always an absolute guarantee that the grid and the evolution of the energy sector was going to be part of this. So I saw a lot of changes in the framework of the legislation as a result of both of your team's great efforts. What I'm excited about is I think we all agree that the grid is at an inflection point. Transmission, distribution, sort of all of the above, things are changing. Expectations are changing. The Assistant Secretary highlighted a few of them, sort of resiliency, redundancy, dealing with climate change. All of these things sort of are resulting in new requirements on the grid. And I'm excited that the infrastructure legislation really, I think, recognizes it. And I really do anticipate that the Assistant Secretary and her team and the team at the department is going to look to use these funds to do something that is transformational. And so that's key to me. This isn't the ARRA 13 years ago, almost to the day, 13 years ago, where the economy was in tatters. This is a different sort of vehicle to really modernize our infrastructure. And I expect and hope that we're going to see some transformational changes to our grid.
Well, thanks, Chris. Before diving into the implementation of the bill, I thought it might be useful just to take a step back and get the perspective of Karen and Kelly, two former senior congressional staffers, on how hard it is to actually get to this point where you have Congress passing a $1 trillion bipartisan bill.
Well, it's easy in the House, and then the Senate gets their hands on things. But no, it's tough, and kudos to both the House and the Senate for doing what they did. I mean, it when you think about, before we turn the cameras on, we were talking about EPAC 2005. That bill it took 5 years to pass that bill, and that was not even appropriations. So it's a tough it's tough to stitch something together. And I think what the ability to get that bill done shows the hunger and the need for investments in all of our nation's infrastructure and in every single state, which made it a little bit easier because every single state, needs roads, bridges, grid. So, but it was a large dollar number, very large dollar number. So, that makes it even tougher.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty amazing that they were able to get this done and so quickly after the Energy Act of 2020 was passed, which was at the end of the previous administration. So not even a year later, you come up with this massive Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it's kind of important to remember that this was really a member initiative in the Senate. I think the leadership would have been in both chambers would have preferred to maybe focus on Build Back Better and try to get that done. But there was a groundswell of support in the Senate. And they came up with the Gang of 20. They brought the gangs back. And you had these moderate members, including Lisa Murkowski, but also Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, coming together. There were 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans who banded together in this gang and decided that they really wanted to work on maybe more traditional infrastructure and bring that through regular order. It spanned a number of committee jurisdictions, including my old committee, the Energy Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, his GAC as well, even more. It was a massive undertaking, but it was really the dedication of these senators who decided that this is what they wanted to do and came together and met in the middle and tried to figure out what was in the realm of the possible and ended up bringing leadership along with them. I mean, again, Mitch McConnell ended up voting for this at the end of the day. And don't forget, it was kind of a tortured path to enactment because while the Senate was able to pass this back in August, the House really kind of held it back for a number of months as they tried to tie it to Build Back Better. And so they waited to enact it because they were afraid that once the infrastructure bill got passed, the momentum behind Build Back Better would stall. So they waited, but finally kind of untangled the two in November and got it to the president's desk. And so it's a little ironic that two of the members, Manchin and Sinema, who have been pinpointed as holding up the House passed Build Back Better measure, actually helped enact and deliver the significant achievement to the Biden administration.
Well, thank you very much. That perspective is really important, given that both of you worked and were successful in getting big pieces of legislation passed during your 10 years up on Capitol Hill. Kind of moving forward to the actual implementation of the bill, the Department of Energy recently announced a reorganization, including the establishment of a new Undersecretary for Infrastructure to help in implementing the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Assistant Secretary, can you discuss the importance of this reorganization? And in particular, how will it affect provisions related to the electricity sector?
Thank you, Andrew. I will probably back up for a second and re-emphasize what Chris brought up, and that the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is really going after strategic investment, transformational investment, lasting investment. And so right in alignment with what Chris brought up earlier. And so the establishment and the new structure that the department is putting in place is really taking a look at optimizing our expertise, but our ability to pull all the options we have to really tackle the investments that are needed, as we continue to drive clean energy, as we try to drive resiliency, and that we think about what is the infrastructure investments we need for the future. We recognize we want to empower states and communities. And so we really need to think about how do we create that lasting infrastructure or that lasting structure so that we can think about infrastructure investments. What we'll do is we'll bring together all the new programs that have been provided through the bipartisan infrastructure law. We will work together with our states and communities. We'll think about the tools we need to develop to really catalyze the economic development under this new structure. We will have a Secretary for Science and Innovation, and that will continue to work on the R&D portfolio within the department. It'll continue to develop the next generation technologies and the development of the excellent capabilities in the national laboratories in support of this mission. But then there will be an Undersecretary for Infrastructure. that's really going to focus on strategic capabilities for managing large-scale demonstration and deployment programs and bringing technologies to the marketplace. We recognize that we need to have that capacity and capability as part of the department's deployment mission, which has been authorized and appropriated by Congress. So one of the things that we recognize is we're going to need to hire. So we have the establishment of a Clean Energy Corps. It's a lever portal and website for folks to join the department, but also to become part of this exciting opportunity and looking at a transformation with infrastructure funding. And once again, I want to reemphasize, this is not a short-term infusion of funding. It is really an opportunity to be very strategic and be very transformational. We recognize, though, we do need to learn some of the lessons from the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is how do we catalyze kind of that technology growth even beyond just the departmental's funding, but be able to have that momentum initiated, the proof of concepts, the benefit analysis done. And so that the framework and the projects that are initiated really have a lasting effect from a transformational point of view. We recognize that we must be very strategic and thinking about all the elements in creating transformation change. And I know Chris will talk about the communication side of things, but we recognize whether we're thinking about EVs, whether we're thinking about road infrastructure, we want to look at dig once. We want to take a strategic approach with communities. We also want the ability to track performance. Did we succeed in creating that transformation that we know can be enabled with these resources? So I'll pause there, and then I'm sure we'll get into more details in a little bit.
Well, thank you very much, Assistant Secretary. As DOE moves forward in implementing the bipartisan infrastructure bill, or the IIJA, I agree it remains a little hard to say that. But as the department moves ahead, what are some of the key questions that the department should be considering? Would love to get all the panelists' views, but maybe we'll start with Chris here.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So, you know, for the folks who aren't on the panel, who haven't been living this piece of legislation for the last many months, to give you a sense of the scale and scope that the Assistant Secretary and her team are going to have to address, the White House guidebook on the legislation is 465 pages long. So that's supposed to be your sweet, short, to the point summary of the legislation. So, and I think the Assistant Secretary highlighted that I think there are more than 60 programs and more than 60 billion, greater than 60 billion that sort of is in place. So, I mean, from a macro perspective, I think I would say, and I think the Assistant Secretary really just answered this question, but is there an underpinning theme of the programs that have funds attached to them? And it may be strategic and transformational, and I think that's great. That will help folks who want to apply really be able to shape their application. And then at the micro level, I mean, I think there are hundreds of questions that come up, but some of the higher level ones are, you know, how do the programs interrelate with one another? You know, I think some of them will probably start earlier than others. But if you do a Venn diagram, and I thought I was the only nerd who had done something like this, and then I heard the Assistant Secretary at the Gridwise event talking about the Venn diagram of the different words in the act, and I thought maybe I had found a kindred soul. But if you do a little sort of Venn diagram, you see words like resilient and modernize and data and things like that across a multitude of the programs. And so one of the key issues I think the department's going to have to tackle is how do those interrelate? And particularly if one starts before another, is an applicant going to have to check a box saying I'm only applying for program A, even though the thing that they're trying to get supported might flow across a multitude of programs. And so, you know, there are questions not only within the department, how does an application work within different programs, but then you have different agencies. So the Department of Transportation, NTIA at the Department of Commerce. I mean, there are ways that a single project could flow across different programs within the Department of Energy, and then across different programs outside of the department. And I think being able to sort of understand and tackle those will be key for the team at the Department of Energy.
Other thoughts from other panelists?
Yeah, one thing that we've been talking about at Gridwise is that, this is a multi-year appropriations bill. So there's, potentially 5 years for some programs where there'll be funding coming out of the agencies. And for potential applicants like our members, particularly the utilities that have kind of long-term investment plans, knowing what might be funded in year one, what might be funded in year two, what might be funded in the out years would be important visibility for potential applicants to have, so they know how to line up their own projects around the kinds of funding opportunities that they may see coming out of the Department of Energy. So, I mean, it's a monumental job for all of the agencies, my thoughts will be with you. We're here as a resource.
Well, I'll just add that, so far I think DOE's been doing, and the administration's been doing a great job about getting information out the door. As Chris mentioned, there's that guidebook. I didn't realize it was over 400 pages. The bill itself is over 1,000 pages, so I guess it's by scale. But you also have started Infrastructure School, a series of webinars for people, and I believe those are going to be available so you can log in afterwards. I know we've had some folks already looking at those. DOE's done their Build a Better Grid initiative to give some kind of timelines for people to look out. So I think all of it's been great so far. I would suggest keeping the web page up to date as much as possible, adding a frequently asked questions provision. One of the things I will just point out, and I think it's good in the long term that DOE is doing this restructuring effort. Just as a former Senate staffer, I worry about the delay in the undersecretary. This new undersecretary position will be a confirmable position. So I'm worried about the delay in Senate confirmation and getting a leader over there to kind of be able to address all of this in a timely manner, because confirmations, as Pat knows, always takes longer than you think it's going to.
So Kelly, this is Pat. You channeled my thoughts. We do have to figure out how to keep things moving, as well as establish an organization. And I think everybody's brought up some very good points that folks should key in. One thing that I would add to that conversation really goes back to read some of the provisions that you're interested in applying for funding, or you think you want to apply for funding under. There are some, requirements in certain positions. Other provisions actually have a lot of flexibility in them. And so it's going to be a process in which we can try to achieve everything that we're hoping to achieve, but meet the requirements that have been established by statute. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind as folks start thinking about cost share requirements. Certain provisions have very strong matching funds cost share requirement. The SGIG, the investment grant type provisions, which is 40107. The resiliency provision has a matching cost share, which is 40101. But it also has a requirement that funds are capped at the last 3 years worth of investments in resilience. So there are some little bit of particularities in the provisions that I really would advocate that folks spend some time kind of reading the provisions and getting a good understanding, especially for the ones that they think are the most opportunistic as they look at community transformation and development. But the second thing that I want to bring up is that we all recognize that this is going to have to be a holistic effort. So it is going to require partnerships that folks may not have thought about before, which is really working with the states, the state energy offices, the communities, and figuring out what are some of those priorities that folks want to look at from a transformational point of view. I will say that the other thing that we're trying to do with listening sessions is really to think about how do we do this better. We recognize that we need to listen and hear from stakeholders. So we want to think about how do we not burden the states. So how do we think about just reducing that burden on states and applicants, and especially if it's a small utility or a small community? How do we ensure that funding can get to folks but not be a burden to them from a reporting requirements point of view? The other thing that we're trying to think about is what is the best way to provide technical assistance? We recognize that states, communities will need help. And is there an opportunity to think about innovative ways to really structure technical assistance that collectively folks can advance their thought processes faster, and then they can set some strategic priorities? An innovative aspect that the department has done in the past is the Communities Leap program, which is a local energy action program, which was really a first shot effort of trying to develop some technical assistance for communities to develop an action plan for clean energy, whether it's renewables, whether it's microgrids, but really thinking about how to, in energy storage, but how to really advance some of that technical assistance at the state and community level. And then I really still go after, we're trying to really push manufacturing, jobs. How do we work together to really, as you know, align our objectives? And it's not going to be easy. We're going to have to spend some time in developing that coordination that's required in order to achieve success. So I'll pause there and then continue with the rest of add my points on the rest of the conversation.
Well, thanks. Maybe we'll dive into transmission, which is an issue that the bipartisan infrastructure bill focused on significantly. Assistant Secretary, there is in particular substantial interest in provisions throughout the industry that would bolster the federal government's backstop authority to approving transmission projects located in national interest electric transmission corridors. Can you provide some insight as to how DOE might exercise this new authority?
Sure, everybody always dives right into the NITSE corridors or the national interest electric transmission corridors. But let me say that the department's really trying to take a whole of, I would say, government, but also all of our authorities in getting transmission built. We know this is a sticky wicket. We know that generally the cards are stacked against transmission. We need transmission to really capitalize on all the renewable energy resources that are out there. We need to have that capacity and that ability to really send renewable energy developed, say, in the Midwest part of the United States to the load centers. So we are going to have to think about that. The Texas freeze also emphasized the importance of a strong transmission system to allowing regions of the country to support each other in emergencies. So collectively, we need transmission as part of the infrastructure, but we also know it's difficult, it's time consuming, and it's very challenging to get transmission projects across the finish line. So with the notice of intent of building a better grid that was released back in January, DOE wanted to recognize all the authorities and the activity it has in trying that will be supportive of getting transmission. And the first and foremost in our thought process is that we have to work with the states, and we really need to build a collaboration with the states on what transmission is required. And that really is getting everybody to understand transmission planning. What is the ISOs and the RTOs doing with respect to transmission? And those are really a 10-year look. We want to get out, 20 to 30 years and say, what is the long-term investments? And so we're thinking about how do we really get the states as well as regional entities to understand this is the long-term vision from a transmission planning point of view. So we recognize that. We also have, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $2.5 billion in a borrowing authority that will allow transmission developers to really come to the department with 3 types of applications. One is a loan. The other one is allowing us to buy capacity on a transmission line to get that across the finish line. And then the third is to just directly invest in transmission projects. And so we are going to use all our authorities, but recognizing the national interest electric transmission designation is still an authority that we have. It is an authority of last resort. We want to be able to incentivize. We want to be able to have stakeholders come together and build transmission projects just because we know how important it is for a reliable and resilient electric grid. So we're hoping between all of that, we'll be able to get more transmission, accelerate more transmission, but actually get it built. Recognizing we want to do, if it's an undergrounding project, say at the sub-transmission level, we want to do dig once. We want to think about the communication architecture as we build transmission. I know this is a lot, but everybody concentrates on NITSE. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of tools, a lot of collective activities that we are going to put forward to really say, help us. We want to incentivize transmission.
Well, maybe sticking with that theme, Assistant Secretary, you made some news last week talking about early wins in the grid and transmission funding. Can you provide maybe some more context as to what might constitute as early wins?
Oh, great question. And the early wins is, from my perspective, is we do have some existing infrastructure. So how can we maximize the capacity on the existing infrastructure? A lot of discussion is around building new transmission lines and new transmission projects. I also don't want folks to forget that there is, how can we expand the existing capacity opportunities? So things like reconductoring, increasing the voltage on existing rights of ways, really is an opportunity of taking advantage of existing rights of way and existing transmission pathways. The other opportunities are grid enhancing technologies, which really are dynamic line ratings or power flow technologies that will allow for grid operators to increase capacity on the transmission system. So I don't want us to spend every moment of our time thinking about new transmission lines, but also think about at least an increase that we can achieve with utilization, especially from a reconductoring point of view, especially from a grid enhancing technology point of view, the utilization of our existing transmission system.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. I know we're getting some questions in the Q&A part here as well. We are planning to spend the last 20 minutes to go over those questions. So please keep submitting them and we will go over them. Maybe moving, and maybe we'll start here with Karen. Beyond just transmission, what other opportunities with respect to the implementation of the infrastructure bill do you see to modernizing the grid going forward?
Well,
and maybe we'll start with Karen.
Yeah, I would say that there is at least $20 billion of money available for the district, well, that owners of distribution systems can apply for. So there are two different programs totaling $11 billion for funding for resilience, and with $1 billion set aside specifically for small and medium utilities. There's the $3 billion in smart grid investment grants with a specific focus on adding flexibility to the grid. And then there's money in the energy efficiency, renewable energy area for batteries. There's money over at Commerce, which Chris has mentioned, at the in the telecom space. But there's $1 billion specifically for middle mile communication infrastructure for utilities. And then there's $42.5 billion in broadband money that is designed to go to the states. But there's a neat provision in there that says that states may not make ineligible utilities. So in other words, in some states, traditionally utilities have not been able to invest in broadband infrastructure, but this bill specifically requires states to allow utilities to be eligible for that funding. And so there's a lot of money, and Chris has mentioned this, in a lot of different places that that can go to modernizing both the transmission and the distribution system.
Kelly, Chris, any additional thoughts?
Kelly, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in addition to the smart grid funding, there's also weatherization funding as well in the transmission sector. There's $7.5 billion set aside for EV charging. I think that's going to be very interesting. And I know DOE is supposed to be working collaboratively with the Department of Transportation, and they've set up a new office to do that. There's going to be a lot of interest in the distribution of those funds and working with states to get the charging network up and running, because really they're looking at the grid not just to lower emissions in the electricity sector, but to also decarbonize other sectors, including transportation, so that the EV charging infrastructure money, I think, is going to be pretty significant. And we were talking in the prep session before this about Ukraine and the cybersecurity threats that brings with it. And there's also additional cybersecurity money for DOE in the IIJA.
Yeah, and Andrew, I would just piggyback on what Kelly just referenced, right? And the Assistant Secretary and Karen also mentioned these, but Texas taught us that we need greater operational intelligence and situational awareness. The wildfires throughout the West over the last 3 to 5 years have been horrific, and that's shown us that we need more tools. Utilities need more tools in their toolbox to do things like de-energize lines that break before they hit the ground. Colonial Pipeline and JPS taught us that the folks that manage critical infrastructure have to be right all the time, and the bad guys only have to be right once. The decarbonization goals have taught us that we're going to have to find a way to integrate just immense amounts of renewable and distributed energy. For all of these things, we're going to have to learn how to move and harness data in ways that we haven't as a sector before. And all of that is supported throughout the legislation. So if you find bits and pieces of the legislation, it talks about data. It talks about things that Anterix is excited about, like broadband networks. It talks about wildfire mitigation and pilots and R&D to support cybersecurity. So transmission is an extremely important component of the grid, but it's a component, and there are a range of other real significant benefits that I think will flow from this legislation.
Well, Chris, maybe we'll stick with you and see, given Anterix's focus on secured utility communications, what are you hearing from some of your utility customers?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you. I mean, we are working, we have 3 customers that have deployed private network or that are deploying private networks. We've got another 60 in the pipeline. And so we have a range, large, medium, and small, of utilities with whom we're talking, and a whole bunch of them are at the least intrigued or interested, and at the far end, really actively reviewing the legislation, watching what the Assistant Secretary and the team are putting out, and excited about a range of the different provisions. So, I think there was a little bit of a if you build it, they will come. And I'm getting a sense that there are a lot of utilities that are really beginning to investigate robustly what opportunities are out there. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them are looking at sort of transformational changes to their operations. And so they are looking at sort of how that fits within the different pieces of the different programs, as the Assistant Secretary has referenced, not only within the Department of Energy, but also across the other agencies. Karen referenced NTIA and Middle Mile. We have a utility with whom we're working closely who really is actively investigating how they can use the Middle Mile support to help deploy both their wireless and their fiber networks throughout their footprint, and then turn around and make that infrastructure available to last mile internet service providers. So I think there are a lot of really neat and interesting conversations. I know we're part of a bunch of them that are happening across the sector, looking at a range of programs.
Chris, when you talk about wildfire mitigation, for example, specifically, how would that happen with an LTE network?
Yeah, Clint, I'm excited because a lot of times when you talk about the integration of broadband, it's hard to visualize sort of what that means. We actually just finished a project with Schweitzer Engineering Labs, one of the leading vendors to the utility sector. And what they investigated was the integration of their solution. It's called falling conductor and broadband. And basically, you can put sensors throughout lines, transmission or distribution, these Schweitzer sensors, and they can recognize when a line is broken, and using the low latency of private broadband, of LTE in this case, they can de-energize that line before it hits the ground. So think of the thousands of wildfires that are started each year from falling lines. Think of the electrocutions. Think of all of the problems that happen in the tornado alley and the hurricane belt, and add this capability in that can de-energize these lines before they actually hit the ground. There is a recognition in the legislation of these types of capabilities. So that's, to me, those are the things that people can visualize when they talk about a modernizing and evolving grid.
Well, it's really exciting and important work, Chris. Moving maybe a little bit away from grid modernization, there are substantial provisions in the infrastructure bill on nuclear and hydro, two important baseload resources. I'd like to ask the group, and maybe start with Kelly, what are some of the key questions and issues do you see in implementing these provisions?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, IIJA is really, I think it really reflects in all of the above energy policy that my former boss, Lisa Murkowski, was always advocating, because it does have important provisions for these non-emitting baseload resources for hydro and for nuclear. And nuclear, it's really interesting. They have a new $6 billion program. And again, it's funded. This isn't just an authorization. This is real money behind it, which is a civil nuclear credit program. And so the idea behind this is to safeguard the nation's existing nuclear fleet and guard against premature retirements, which we've seen really all over the country. And so this is a new program. You might recall that the previous administration tried to intervene to prop up nuclear and coal plants. That was unsuccessful with an inquiry at FERC. But now this is a congressionally authorized program and funded just for nuclear. So everybody's going to be looking to see how DOE is able to implement that and what kind of the timelines are for nuclear plants to request this type of assistance. But also for nuclear, which might be getting overlooked, is the hydrogen hub provision from IIJA. And there is a ton of industry interest in the implementation of these hydrogen hubs. The Energy Department was directed to establish at least 4 hubs, and Congress was pretty specific about what you need to see in them. One of them has to demonstrate hydrogen that is developed from nuclear resources. So there will be a nuclear hydrogen hub angle that I think folks are very, very interested in. And on hydropower, this is something I worked on a lot at the Energy Committee. This is an example with the Energy Act of 2020 extended authorizations for something that was originally authorized back in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. And these were for incentive payments for hydrogen facilities for capacity additions or efficiency improvements. So you got the extended authorization back in 2020 at the end of the year, but now IIJA has come in and funded these 2 provisions at substantial amounts. So you've got the real money behind that as well. And there's some more research and development for hydro. There's some more work on pump storage. That's the most storage we have in this country right now is through hydro. But both hydro and nuclear are something that my former committee, the Senate Energy Committee, they're very interested in continuing to work on. This is hydro in particular is something where Joe Manchin, the chairman of the committee, and ranking member John Barrasso have found alignment on. They started this year, the second session of the 117th Congress, with a kickoff hearing oversight on hydropower and what more they can do. And I think they're interested in continuing to legislate in this area. And I will say on nuclear, they're interested in that as well, because I just saw a notice come out for a legislative hearing for next week. And there's another nuclear bill on that legislative hearing focused on supply chain issues. So there's a lot to implement from IIJA, but Congress is not done in either of these 2 areas.
Kelly, I should mention with respect to hydrogen, we will be doing a webinar on that subject on March 22nd. It's such an important new development. So thank you for mentioning that.
It really is. And DOE, of course, just came out with their NOI on it to provide some more guidance. And Pat, everybody's waiting for the solicitation on hydrogen hubs.
Any comments from the other panelists on the nuclear hydrogen or hydropower provisions?
I'll jump in on the hydropower. I think that when we talk about the significant addition of renewable energy, intermittent renewable energy, it's driving some conversations about how we use the hydro facilities that we have. We tend to think of them as just delivering power, but they are actually, in addition to pump storage, hydro dams actually potentially could provide those grid services, the ancillary services, in addition to just the power. And what we have to figure out is how we can better value the services that all generation, all people plugging into the grid, things plugging into the grid, can be compensated for the different services that they can provide in addition to just the electricity. So that and the hydro industry is just beginning to think about what they would need in order to be able to manage the dams differently. And there's also a really interesting development with respect to where the environmental community is with respect to hydropower. And the hydropower industry and the group of environmental organizations have been talking pretty seriously over the last couple of years and came up with a framework for agreement on how to pursue increasing the efficiency or sort of retooling existing dams and considering run-of-river hydro, tidal power, and other ways of getting more energy from existing dams in exchange for considering where dams might be removed to free up passage for fish in some rivers. And so that's a really very important dialogue to be continuing right now, because we will need that baseload power from dams. And many of them face years and years of FERC process for approval for any kind of work on those dams, and ensuring that the environmental community is on board and doesn't challenge the process is going to be really important to maximize the clean energy that we can get out of hydropower.
Well, I'll just say it's been great to see some bipartisan cooperation on hydropower, hydrogen, nuclear. I think we need every last megawatt of clean power, and I've said there were no better friends for hydro than Senator Murkowski, and no better staffers when she was up on the Hill than Kelly when it came to hydropower. So an important resource, and we certainly appreciate the time and efforts that you have put on that issue. Maybe moving to EVs, another exciting part of the infrastructure bill in an area that has also significant implications for the grid as well. The infrastructure bill put $7.5 billion to EVs, maybe more coming down the road. We'll see with the reconciliation bill at some point. But out of that, there is a new DOE Department of Transportation joint office. So maybe I'll turn back to the Assistant Secretary. Would love to get your thoughts on that joint office and kind of the work on EV deployment and implications for the grid.
So Andrew, thank you for the question. And I actually want to thank Karen, Kelly, and Chris, because I think this has been a great opportunity to talk about the breadth and depth of all the provisions and how important collectively the bill is. And so as we think about the electric vehicle deployment, we now have to think from a grid perspective how that's going to change the load profiles in the United States. But let's go back to what has gone on. So in December, Vice President Harris announced the EV charging action plan, which outlines steps that the administration is taking to accelerate EV charging investments as in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Also in December, DOE and DOT announced the creation of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which will provide technical assistance to states as they develop a comprehensive EV charging plan. In February, the Department of Transportation released an EV rural charging toolkit, which is one of the first steps, and it's a one-stop shop resource for rural communities as they start thinking about EV charging and infrastructure projects. In February, DOT and DOE announced the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program These are a lot of long names. And this program is really to build out a national electric vehicle charging network. And it's going to provide nearly $5 billion over 5 years to help states create a network of EV charging stations along designed alternative fuel corridors. And so we're thinking about this as particularly the interstate highway system. Now, as I initially had said, and I thank my colleagues in the Office of Energy Efficiency and the Transportation Program for providing me this information. But from my perspective, what I want to, as we think about a holistic point of view as with respect to EV charging, is we need to think about smart charging. We need to think about HVDC growth. And how do we incorporate that as part of a whole community, whole of transformation of the infrastructure, the communications requirements as part of that. So it's not only just about building charging stations, but it's how to think about the smart charging so that we can really optimize the electricity generation and the capacity we need as part of our infrastructure system in the United States. So it's some of the things that I think we need to continue to really grow and advance the conversation and dialogue around there. And I'll pause there.
Karen, I know GridWise has been spending a lot of time thinking about the impacts of widespread EV deployment and the implications for the grid, and GridWise has been providing a lot of thought leadership, but maybe I'll turn to you.
Well, it's good timing. We're going to be releasing a paper tomorrow that looks at the immediate investments that need to happen on the grid side in order to accommodate this rapid transportation electrification. And I will say that it's important to think we're really in the infancy of the conversations about how we're going to integrate electrified vehicles onto the grid. We're really talking about how do we meet the load? How do we set up time of use programs, and then how do we implement some managed charging? That's the beginning stages of truly integrating electric vehicles onto the grid. And at some point down the road, we expect to be able to aggregate maybe the battery power in vehicles and sell that power into the wholesale markets under FERC Order 2222. But there's a lot of things that are going to have to happen on the grid through grid operations, through planning, gaining visibility into even where electric vehicles are today that are going to have to happen. So our paper is looking at what are the immediate no regrets investments that'll have to happen as we get this kind of exponential growth, but ensuring that those investments set the stage for later investments when we really get this true vehicle to grid integration.
Other comments from the panelists? We are getting close to the Q&A session. A couple last questions for me, and then I know we have several questions that have been entered into the Q&A. But if the participants do have questions, please feel free to enter them, and we will turn to those here shortly. Assistant Secretary, we've gone through a lot over the last hour or so. I thought maybe I'll just ask if you have any kind of last guidance on how stakeholders can engage with the department as the process moves forward on implementing the infrastructure bill.
I think one of the most important questions. First of all, I would say that DOE is hosting stakeholder listening sessions, education sessions on different aspects of the infrastructure bill to pay attention to the department's website as we really engage in some of these briefing sessions, listening sessions that we're having. That's first and foremost. The second is really to, I would say, make sure that you're engaged in the state activities as states look at what infrastructure they need moving forward, and really pay attention to how folks are organizing around prioritizing investments and what are some of the most transformational but the biggest benefit investments moving forward. The third area is that the department will be publishing RFIs, notice of intents, across the different provisions. So to the extent that you are able, please provide us comments, please provide us feedback, It is our way of providing a transparent process for stakeholders to provide the department feedback, but also to tease out some very important issues that may be something we're trying to figure out as we implement a provision and thinking how to best do it, how to best get stakeholders organized, but also give some early insights on some of the thinking that we're having. So I really would advocate, to the extent that everybody has the ability to, is spend some time and provide us some comments and feedback. And then the last area is really to think about what I will say performance-driven priorities. We've talked about many times over that the goal is transformational change, lasting change, really getting kind of the economic benefit for the investments moving forward. And so really think about what are some of the ways that we can actually demonstrate progress along those priorities. And so there's a huge opportunity out there. Let's really make a difference with that opportunity. Let's really make strategic investments that can be a platform for enabling smart grid technologies, but information, better data, better decision-making moving forward. So I think that is really the opportunity that's ahead of us. And that is really to capitalize on the investments and the dollars that are available.
Pat, as we do that, I know you're depending on stakeholders for innovation here wisely. What, as you dream, what could be some successful outcomes 5 years from now?
I don't want to give all the ideas away. I'd like to see what the states and the utilities and communities come up with. But that was a very good way of trying to figure out if I have some priorities to put on the table. The way I will answer it is as we look at getting ahead of the game for electric vehicles, for resilience, and consumers really take a look at their communities and we say, what has the dollars really done to make some transformational change? And we want to be able to really document those changes and really think about the activities as a platform for the future. I look at, and I'll learn from some of the transformational lessons learned from the Recovery Act. One of the things was everybody really said, all right, meters, why are meters so important? Meters actually allow for greater fidelity for consumers to understand their consumptions. Although we weren't able to get all the consumer tools available, we were able to get outage management systems, better management from hurricanes, pre-placement of resources. Back in the day, it was really, how come it's taking so long for utilities to really assess the damage? Now with the ability to have sensors and the data management system, we've actually transformed, I think the utility industry has transformed how they do outage management, how they can minimize the number of customers that are impacted from a hurricane because they have smart switches that are able to really narrow the outage to a very small number of customers. And that really has transformed how we all think about outage management and response analysis across the federal agencies as we look at how we apply the federal government's resources to an event. And so collectively, that's raised the whole performance level up. And so I look at that as just, very insightful from a transformational perspective, just as a lessons learned.
Thank you, Pat.
And finally, before turning it to Q&A, we'll do just a quick lightning round of what maybe everybody's most important takeaway is when it comes to the infrastructure bill. Chris went last time, so maybe we'll start first with him.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll be super fast. Excitement. I'm excited from what I've heard from the other panelists, particularly from what I've heard from the Assistant Secretary. And I think there are opportunities within the energy sector, but also outside to really transform our infrastructure in ways that will support the next generation. So excitement.
Kelly, we'll turn to you next.
Oh, it is exciting. I agree with you, Chris. It's very exciting. And I guess I'm very interested in the implementation of this gigantic, massive bill. It's going to be hard for the departments to put their arms around it. Congress has given you some really tight timetables, specific statutory deadlines, which we recognize that the agencies don't always meet, but they still are there. And just hearkening back to the Nietzsche conversation, I'm cognizant of when we put this initially into place in EPACT 05, it was incredibly controversial. We did this bifurcated backstop signing authority, and then it became absolutely ineffective because the Fourth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit tore it apart. And so I'm looking at this for implementation of not just the tight timelines and the quick turnaround, but to do so with a very full and robust record to guard against the litigation that is inevitably coming from all of this. So, it's important that it's still going to be in place. And I know with Nietzsche's, it's ideally, it won't even need to be used. You'll end up collaborating with states. But I would hate to see what happened in the implementation of 05 happen here with IIJA.
Karen, we'll turn to you next.
Sure. Well, when I was at Department of Energy working on the first quadrennial energy review, so that was in 2015, 2016, we looked at all energy infrastructure, so oil and gas, pipelines, generation, the full suite of infrastructure that this country has. And it was clear even back then that the electricity sector was undergoing the most dramatic transformation, both within itself because of the new technologies and customer preferences and the ability to interact with the grid, but also as it was, when we talk about the increasing dependence of this country on reliable, extremely reliable electricity. And so, in response to these dramatic changes, this is a historic investment that's going to really help make sure that that it's happening. It's unevenly happening right now, and this funding is going to help all communities benefit from this changing nature of the electricity sector, and to smooth out some of the challenges that low resource communities, low resource utilities may have in catching up to the deployment of technologies that are going to really allow, as Pat has said, the grid to be that platform for the clean energy economy.
Assistant Secretary, we'll close with you before turning to the audience's questions.
And I'll be quick. I agree with all my colleagues' comments here. I think it is an opportunity for us to think about the future. And a lot of folks are rightfully so looking at the weather impacts. But as we start looking in the future, what are we going to need to leapfrog to ensure that we have the capacity and capability to have a reliable and resilient grid moving forward? So I thank you all for the dialogue because I thought it was a great conversation. Look forward to the questions.
Great, thanks so much. And I see the questions coming in, so please feel free to submit them. We will try to get to as many of them as possible. First question, will microgrids developed by airports and other non-utility enterprises be funded under the infrastructure bill?
So I'll start with that, and it really depends on the provisions that an entity is applying for, and also the eligible entities under what I will say preventing outages and enhancing the resiliency of the electric grid, which is section 40101. There is opportunities from a resilience perspective to look at infrastructure improvements from that point of view. But the eligible entities is a variety of entities that can apply under those provisions, as well as working in partnership with the states. For the provision that's under 40103, which is what I call the innovative resilience provisions, which is a program upgrading our electric infrastructure for reliability and resilience. That program is actually looking for some more innovative solutions, which of course microgrids are an opportunity underneath that. The eligible entity there though is the states. And so it would have to be a partnership with the states. So I think the answer is that you have to look at the provisions. You have to really think about how a project could be developed and supported under those provisions. especially looking at some of the more innovative opportunities.
Thanks, Assistant Secretary. The next question talks about the 2017 Tax Act, which provided that government grants to companies, whether public or privately held, must be recognized by the company as taxable income. The infrastructure bill exempted certain water and sanitary projects, but no other projects, including all electric grid and transmission grants to companies. As a result, the net after-tax proceeds available for capital investment from grants will be substantially reduced. Is this being discussed by the Department of Energy and Industry?
So I will have to be straightforward on this one. I will have to go back to my colleagues and really look for an answer from that perspective, since I'm not in and haven't been monitoring all the tax law. So I will apologize, but say that I will take that question back and make sure that we take a look at it. And I don't know if my colleagues here on the panel may have some other insights regarding this question.
The only thing I would add, Andrew, is I think this question is illustrative of how complex the undertaking is from both an applicant perspective, but also from the department's perspective. You know, the Assistant Secretary did highlight that some of the programs have matching grants requirements. Some of them have caps on what can be spent based on what you've spent the last couple of years. Some of the programs, the money can all be spent in the first year. Some it's very well defined. Eligible entities change from program to program. The states and tribes often get half of the funding, but not for every program. So you really do have to do your homework and dive in. And yes, there are tax ramifications to a number of these as well.
I just would say I am very cognizant that there are tax implications. I would say in the industry discussions that that I've been a part of, that this issue hasn't bubbled up, at least at the top. That's not to say that individual companies aren't thinking about the specific tax implications, but at least from an industry perspective, I haven't seen a significant focus or concern on it, at least here to date. Maybe going on to the next audience question. The deployment of fiber deep into the distribution sector is an infrastructure that can enable a variety of benefits, from grid resiliency, smart grids solutions, communications, EV stations, and many other applications. How would a grant request for fiber infrastructure deep into that distribution system overlap in DOE in NTI grant programs? What would be the best approach for pursuing such a grant?
So I don't know if I can answer all the approaches for pursuing such a grant. Maybe Chris could have some insights from his perspective. But as I look at whether it's the smart grid infrastructure grant type program or some of the other programs that are available, it's really taking a comprehensive approach. We know when we build transmission and distribution infrastructure, we build the underlying communications as part of that. And so as I think about the need from a smart city point of view or a modernized utility point of view, it's really thinking about how do you ensure that you have a reliable electric system, but also reliable comm systems as part of that infrastructure investment.
Yeah, and I would just add, again, it raises a very a not unique issue, in that an application such as the one that's imagined in the question could fit within the 40107, sort of the grid flexibility, where it could help to facilitate the movement of data. It could fit in the middle mile section, which is under NTIA, the auspices of NTIA. But in that instance, you're not providing last mile service. You're specifically sort of handing off that capability to a broadband provider. And then, as Karen referenced, it very much could fit in the larger 40 billion-ish tranche of funding that NTIA has for broadband. So, you know, it could, it's sort of the question I think I raised at the very beginning is there are applications and projects that can flow across programs and across agencies.
I think I look back at one of my favorite grants in the Recovery Act was to Chattanooga's utility EPB for smart grid investments, and it was an $111 million grant that was matched by EPB for $111 million. So a really expensive project, but it was, as Pat mentioned, it was a comprehensive smart grid. So that in addition to laying fiber, they also did, you know, lots of other upgrades as well. And I think that if that's the approach, then likely the DOE grants are the place for it. But I think if you're, and we'll see how this develops, but if you read the language of the Commerce Department programs, they are very specific to the kind of telecom, the communications side of things. And so it's likely that utilities would, you know, they're all going to bring, these are all cost share programs. And so they would likely bring their own investment strategy, and maybe their private investments are doing some of the other grid modernization work, and they're applying for just their communications investments through the commerce programs. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how the guidance comes out on that, because I, like the other two panelists have said, you could see how there would be multiple places that a utility could go.
And this question looks maybe initially targeted at Karen, but would love all the panelists' thoughts if they have some views. Karen, I think during your comments, you mentioned that the infrastructure bill specifically allows utilities to provide broadband service. Does this apply to municipally owned utilities?
Yeah, and Chris might have, we've had conversations about what that little provision means, and it goes way deep into court cases that I am not well versed in. So
yeah,
Chris,
Karen,
take it away, Chris.
So I think it's easy to read it as suggesting that utilities cannot be prevented from applying for the broadband funding. And I don't think it distinguishes between and amongst the different, you know, investor owned as compared to municipals or co-ops.
Nope,
and so, you know, right. And so municipal broadband at times has been a divisive, a particularly politically divisive idea, that the government would support municipalities in competition against other non publicly owned, community owned broadband providers. But this one doesn't have any of those specific limitations. And so I would have to assume that it's very logical to conclude that a municipal broadband provider, municipal utility that wants to be a broadband provider could secure the funds.
Yeah, and I think this was that Senator Cantwell was very clear that she wanted that provision in there, that clause, because she wanted to create some competition between the telecom providers with the telecom providers. So I don't think her intention at all was that it would be limited to a certain type of utility.
And one last question from the audience. How will the distribution grid be kept in balance when all sorts of distributed energy resources operate independently rather than in a coordinated manner designed to optimize operation of the grid?
You go, Pat.
All right, I'll get started. So a couple of points that I want to bring up, and this goes back to really thinking about the holistic design of the grid, as well as the roles and responsibilities of different entities in that operation. So we think about the distribution utility as a distribution service provider, a DSO, a distribution reliability entity. And as we move forward, what we're going to have to do is actually have some of the visibility that's necessary to understand how loads are changing, where are the generation resources, and how that's all going to be coordinated. So part of it is the visibility. The second part of it is actually having the ability to do modeling on behalf of a region, to really look at how things, what is assets are necessary in an investment point of view from moving forward from a distribution utility. So think about EV deployments. If we know what the load growth and the profile with respect to EV deployments, we'll be able to look at some of the infrastructure investment requirements and do the analysis on keeping the balance in the distribution system. The role of microgrids as we look at emergencies and how that can be utilized and optimized moving forward. So it is an enduring and a conversation that has to occur between the state offices, the energy offices, the utility commissions, utilities, and really understanding kind of that distribution service provider type, DSP type analogy for a grid moving, for a distribution utility moving forward, but also just the rules of the road for everybody to engage in that, because there would be opportunities from distribution aggregators and how they want to play and the role they play in the marketplace. And so there could be opportunities. But the last point that I would say is we also need to have enabling technologies such as transactive type technologies and enabling this to happen. So a lot of things need to happen, but it is definitely an opportunity moving forward.
And I would say that I think it's completely unrealistic for us to expect every individual DER owner to be responsible for the balance of the system. And so what we're going to see, Pat mentioned enabling technologies, we're going to see a lot of automation. And I think, your smart thermostat is the beginning of, the kinds of automation that can happen. Because individual customers are not necessarily going to respond on a very timely basis all the time to pricing signals, although those are going to be really important. And I think we're going to be operating the grid differently. We're going to need new different kinds of regulatory regime. But we're going to see the growth of a new player, which is this distribution aggregator, and that's where that participation of these aggregators with the markets and the regulators and the utilities is going to be really key to making sure that those aggregated DER resources can be delivered when called upon to actually provide that system balance.
And Karen triggered me one other issue other opportunity that I want to bring to the table is the role of energy storage. Energy storage deployed as a utility asset and also as a customer asset will be a game changer from a load management point of view. And so anything that can provide that flexible load, so demand response, energy storage, fast ramping technologies, really provides that opportunity and value as a service to the grid for balancing and looking at reliable system operations. So don't forget the role of energy storage and how that can play.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for this interesting and wonderful discussion today. I know they're all very busy, so we appreciate their time and their insights, and wanted to thank all of the attendees as well for taking time out of their day to join this afternoon. So maybe with that, I will turn it back over to Clint.
Well, what an awesome panel. Assistant Secretary Chris, Karen, Kelly, Andrew, thank you so much. Beautiful development of this topic, and lots of teasers to make us hopeful that there will be great outcomes here. Pat, thank you for your precious time today. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming back. You are always an audience favorite for our programs. And great to see you all. On behalf of the audience, I'm just going to give you an ovation here and really appreciate you all. Great job.